on this Friday night, honoring former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney.
He was a man of enormous gifts.
His undeniable influence on Canada and beyond, and the lasting consequences for Conservatives.
There seemed to be almost a cataclysmic fracturing that occurred.
Laid to rest, the funeral for the fearless Alexei Navalny. How his mourners in Moscow mirrored his defiance. And Body Shop Canada goes bankrupt. What's in store for the beauty and cosmetics company?
Global National with Farah Nasser. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Tributes are pouring in for Brian Mulroney, including this book of condolences set up inside the House of Commons. Parliament was suspended for the day as MPs pay their respects to a truly transformational Prime Minister. Good evening and thank you for joining us. A state funeral will be held in Montreal for the 84-year-old who died yesterday in Florida, surrounded by his family. He was hospitalized after a fall at his home in Palm Beach. Mulroney led this country for nearly 9 years and left an indelible mark. There is a lot to say about his legacy, and David Akin begins our coverage tonight.
I think Canadians are reflecting on what an extraordinary statesman Prime Minister Mulroney was. The idea of service and devotion to country ran through everything he did.
He was a man of enormous gifts, and at the end of the day, in terms of his government, he wanted to do good things for Canada. He wanted to solve problems for Canada. He wanted a strong economy for Canada.
He was also one of the first and probably the most strident opponent of apartheid in South Africa.
Indeed, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa said his country has not forgotten Brian Mulroney's global leadership. He spoke out against apartheid, Ramaphosa said in a statement, and took a stand when many in the international community were wavering.
You know, that wasn't the popular thing to do, especially for a conservative government, but it just was the right thing to do.
I say au revoir today.
Mulroney gave the eulogies at the funerals of both Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, a rare honor for a Canadian leader, but also a capstone on a career in which Canada-U.S. relations were his highest priority. He parlayed friendships with two presidents into the most significant trade deal in Canada's history and an acid rain treaty that literally saved thousands of Canadian lakes.
He respected the United States. He was fascinated by it. He understood it probably in detail better than most of us did. He was excited. I think he was moved by the challenge. He knew it was going to be difficult to persuade them, but there was enough ego in him that he thought, if anybody can do this, I can do this.
He was smart and charming, fun and kind, former U.S. President George W. Bush said in a statement. My family is grateful for Brian Mulroney's friendship. Jean Charest, now 90 years old, also had fond memories of his former adversary.
In politics, opposition is opposition. It's like playing hockey. You can fight on the ice, but have a beer together after that. And we had a lot of things in common.
Among the things they had in common, they both grew up in modest circumstances, both in rural Quebec. One, of course, in Shawinigan and the other in Baie-Comeau. And they both went on to lead their country. Jeff.
David Akin in Ottawa. Thanks, David. Mulroney's leadership altered the trajectory of the Tories. The federal Conservative Party, which he led to 2 consecutive majorities, began to crumble near the end of his time in office before giving rise to a new political landscape. Eric Sorensen explains.
It was a political masterstroke, a conservative leader who could win the entire country, the West, Ontario, Quebec, and the East.
We begin together to make things right for Canada.
I have never seen anybody who had the capacity to bring people together. As a manager of people, he was truly extraordinary.
With successive majority governments, Brian Mulroney wagered he could achieve national unity to bring Quebec into the Constitution. But it exposed cracks in the Conservative coalition. Western Conservatives felt alienated and turned to Preston Manning and the Reform Party. Lucien Bouchard left and took Quebec nationalists with him. Bouchard remembers.
We had this period of darkness where we were on both sides. It was all about the future of Canada and Quebec.
By the time Mulroney handed the reins to Kim Campbell, federal progressive conservatism was an endangered species.
And I'll now turn you over to some of my best friends.
There seemed to be almost a cataclysmic fracturing that occurred.
The center of gravity for a more populist conservatism in Canada emerged. Even on those terms, Mulroney saw the need to unite Conservatives once again.
That fact that he was in favor of it carried a lot of weight in a lot of different circles, particularly amongst progressive members of our party.
The political environment has become more polarized among Conservatives, but not only Conservatives.
We've moved to wedge politics.
This former cabinet minister says today's leaders could take a page from Mulroney's style.
We need to take some of the meanness out of politics, and we need to recognize that politics should be about public service, but what we can do for the country.
And this former party leader thinks Canadian politics could take a page from Mulroney's big tent conservatism.
It's still very much in the DNA of the Conservative Party. To this day, is very important, and it is prescient for anyone who wants to form government. You have to look beyond just your base.
Even some old foes see Mulroney in a different light today.
Old reformers like me had a newfound appreciation for the old man. He was willing to look at the bigger picture and put the national interest first.
And his once bitter rival says Mulroney may have failed on national unity, but he tried.
I'm sad because Canada and Quebec lost a great man. He did great things.
Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
And later in the newscast, I'll speak with Brian Mulroney's longtime colleague and friend Jean Charest, his emotional final moments with the former Prime Minister, and what today's politicians could learn from Mulroney's example. Turning to other news now, a member of the NDP is blasting the provincial and federal governments in response to a Global News investigation. It revealed allegations that for-profit group home companies in Ontario's child welfare system are targeting and in some cases even charging more to care for Indigenous kids. Our chief investigative correspondent, Carolyn Jarvis, joins us now with more. Carolyn, what reaction are you hearing?
Jeff, NDP MP Charlie Angus had strong words saying our investigation exposed a failure at multiple levels of government, that leaders are not ensuring that child welfare money is reaching communities and families. Instead, it's going to what he calls factory mills of exploitation.
This is the dark secret of Canada, the exploitation of Indigenous children, taking them away from their families, an entire industry that exploits children. We've been through this so many times and it continues.
Our investigation uncovered dozens of allegations that some for-profit group homes in Ontario may be targeting Indigenous youth, especially in the far north, where communities have few options. And our exclusive analysis of spending by children's aid societies showed those Indigenous agencies in the north paid, on average, 26% more per day for a child to live in a group home compared to non-Indigenous agencies across the province over a decade. We put our findings to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Here's what he had to say.
And this Global News investigation is highlighting that there is an increased urgency on making sure that kids who are at risk get the support of a community and of an identity and a culture in which they can ground themselves instead of getting lost in a system that doesn't see them for everything they are.
Trudeau did not outline any new measures which will be taken to address these findings and the companies allegedly targeting Indigenous youth. Jeff?
Carolyn Jarvis in Toronto. Thanks, Carolyn. And you can watch the full investigation in a special 1-hour edition of The New Reality. The Business of Indigenous Children in Care airs tonight right here on Global. Mourners gathered in Moscow for the funeral of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. A heavy police presence didn't deter thousands from flooding the streets outside the church, waiting for hours to pay their respects to the Kremlin critic. A human rights advocacy group says more than 90 people were arrested across the country. Redmond Shannon reports on the somber display of defiance.
A crowd of Russians chanting a name that their president Vladimir Putin famously never utters in public. Their final tribute to Alexei Navalny 2 weeks after he died at a penal colony in Russia's Arctic. A few thousand braved the Moscow cold and the risk of arrest, some even chanting anti-Putin slogans. The Kremlin has outlawed Navalny's opposition movement, calling it extremist.
We were very afraid. We arrived early and were standing here for a long time, hiding our flowers and cameras.
I took it as a personal loss. it is very difficult to process it.
Even if they are not arrested on site, some feared they might face consequences later, including the exiled widow of murdered Putin critic Alexander Litvinenko.
Every lights now are fitted with a camera, surveillance camera.
Human rights group OVD Info said dozens of people were arrested in connection with the funeral, mostly at demonstrations outside of Moscow. The most notable absentee was Navalny's widow, Yulia, and their 2 children, all in exile. Yulia Navalnaya alleges Putin killed her husband, and she has promised to continue his work. On Friday, she posted this video with a personal rather than a political message to Alexei. Canada's ambassador to Russia was there with other Western diplomats, but Sarah Taylor says they were blocked from entering the church. Navalny's parents led the mourners. His mother, Lyudmila, said she pushed back against authorities who wanted to see a private funeral. Navalny's team said finding a funeral home and even a hearse was a struggle. Alexei Navalny did it his way, knowing that there were consequences for opposing Putin. His supporters are fully aware of that too. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
The United Nations has added its voice to the growing chorus calling for an independent investigation into the deaths of Palestinians during an aid delivery. Gaza's health authority, run by Hamas, says at least 117 people were killed and hundreds more injured on Thursday as trucks carrying food arrived in Gaza City. Hamas accused Israel of shooting civilians. The Israeli military admits its soldiers fired, but in self-defense, and that most of the victims died in a stampede. The incident is fueling calls for Israel to allow more aid into Gaza. The U.S. just announced plans to join other nations, including Canada, in airdropping food and supplies. A critical court ruling for your online privacy. Coming up, what police must now do before accessing someone's internet address. Plus, why the Body Shop is closing nearly a third of its Canadian stores. Welcome back. The Supreme Court made a key ruling today regarding your online privacy. Police must now have a warrant before obtaining a person or organization's IP address. IP addresses are numbers that identify devices connected to the internet. In a split decision, the court ruled IP addresses are protected under the Charter's reasonable expectation of privacy, even if there's no personal information attached. The ruling is based on a case in which Calgary police asked for IP addresses from a company during a fraud investigation that eventually led to a suspect's arrest. The Body Shop is closing nearly a third of its stores in this country after the Canadian subsidiary of the cosmetics brand filed for bankruptcy protection. The company says it will begin liquidating 33 stores nationwide immediately and will also end online sales. It is also ceasing all operations in the United States. The shakeup comes weeks after its faltering parent company in the UK underwent a major restructuring, closing 75 stores in Britain while laying off 40% of its headquarters staff.
He really changed the country for the better.
Still ahead, former Quebec Premier Jean Charest reflects on Brian Mulroney, his friend and father figure. Brian Mulroney made a profound impact on our country and his colleagues, those who worked with him during his time as Prime Minister, including Mulroney's longtime friend, Jean Charest, who served in Mulroney's cabinet before becoming Premier of Quebec, of course. And Jean Charest joins us now from Montreal. Mr. Charest, thank you so much for taking the time, and condolences, of course, for your loss. I understand that you saw Mr. Mulroney just days ago. So what was that final meeting like for you?
Well, we talked regularly over the phone, and the last time we chatted, he said, "I'd like to see you," and he was in Florida. So I flew down last week and saw him on Saturday night, and we had it was a very emotional meeting. He's quite weak at that time, Jeff. He had lost a lot of weight and even had, difficulty basically walking, but he was very alert. And he was sort of feeling a bit down at some points in the conversation. He even said to me, "Jean, I don't think I'm going to be here for Christmas." And I tried to focus him on the fact that this is the 40th anniversary this year of the election of his government. and that we should be organizing some events to celebrate his accomplishments. And I think that is something that he would have looked forward to. But in the meantime, we lost him, and the country has lost a great prime minister.
Yeah, certainly glad you got to see him one last time. And you mentioned the 40th anniversary. You were a young man, a 26-year-old MP when you started working in Mulroney's government. What did he mean for you, both professionally and personally?
In the leadership race between him and Mr. Clark, I had supported Mr. Clark and decided that I wanted to run to be a candidate, and his camp were not very favorable to that idea. I was 25 when we did the nomination. I won it. And finally they warmed up to it. I get elected in the wave of 1984, and after that he took me under his wing. So he understood people, and he was good to them. And he was of that generation who felt that you have to take tough decisions, and the art of politics is surviving them. And he did. Free trade, national unity, GST, international policy. He really, really changed the country for the better, and we owe him a lot because of that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned some of the many examples there. I mean, I've heard you and others describe him as a transformational leader, from GST to free trade and others. How would you describe his legacy? In particular, what stands out most to you?
Well, it is that courage, that sense of courage he had to pull ahead. And he was very resilient, because there were times where the government was very unpopular. What I remember about him is extraordinary ability to lead, and I learned a lot from that, Jeff. In my own job when I was leader here in Quebec, we'd go to caucus meetings, and every member of Parliament, senators would show up to caucus meetings. He spoke at the end, and it was every week. It was just spectacular. He was inspirational. He would lift us. I mean, we'd walk out of that room, you'd think we were at 60% in the polls. The media thought we were on drugs, and so that's how powerful he was. But he was very loyal to people, extremely generous. For me, he was a mentor. He was a friend, and almost like a father to me in a lot of ways. So we're all very lucky to have had him as a prime minister, and me lucky to have him in my life.
Yeah, is there anything in particular from his example that you think politicians today could or should learn from, take a page from?
Brian Mulroney had a sense of nobility about his job. He believed in the country first. And even if he was Irish, and had this, fighter instinct, he knew that at the end of the day, that you need to reach out to others. And I don't see a lot of that happen. That's very much on the human side. I think no one reached out as much to his adversaries, to others, than he did. The other thing is this. He understood that to be a leader and to govern means you sometimes have to make very controversial and difficult decisions, but you do it because it's your responsibility to do it, and you accept that responsibility as opposed to shying away from controversy.
Yeah, and hard to deny the courage that he showed in making some of those many tough decisions during his time. Jean Charest, former Premier of Quebec and former Cabinet Minister under Brian Mulroney, thank you so much for taking some time. Really appreciate it. Condolences again.
Thank you, Jeff.
Up next, Brian Mulroney's quiet acts of kindness. Welcome back. Since news of his death yesterday, people across this country have been sharing stories about Brian Mulroney's impact on Canada and international affairs. But away from the spotlight, he was also a man who went out of his way for ordinary people, often with a profound impact. Mike Armstrong tonight on some stories you likely haven't heard.
That was my line, sir.
It was.
He was a man with ambition, not just to a position. Brian Mulroney worked to accomplish big things, but it was also a life of small gestures. Bob Rae's entire career was spent on the other side of the political aisle, as an NDP MP and later Ontario Premier. But his memories are of brotherhood, not battles. He wrote this Thursday night. When my brother died, Brian Mulroney was the first political leader to call, as he was when I was elected Premier in 1990, when I was defeated, and at so many moments. He was my friend despite our differences. Seamus O'Regan is remembering one of those calls as well. The Labour Minister stepped away from politics in 2016, battling alcoholism. Quote, "At a dark point in my life, he called. I'll never forget it. His compassion is something I could never repay." O'Regan says there are thousands who are right now remembering what he calls Mulroney's quiet kindness, similar scenes out of the spotlight. Well, a longtime Global National cameraman once got some rough news as he was setting up to interview Mulroney. His father had just suffered a heart attack. The former Prime Minister's reaction? He asked if he could record a video.
"Hi, Malcolm. I hear that you haven't been well in the last couple of days, and I just finished a little job here, and I wanted to, with your son, and I just wanted to pass on my very best wishes to you, and get well soon. They all need you back, particularly in New Brunswick. So God bless you and good luck to you."
Now, that was for someone he didn't know, but it was the sort of thing he did whenever he could. It's not hard to find foes who'll say Brian Mulroney did the wrong thing politically, but it's also not hard to find friends, foes, or even strangers who'll say he did the right thing personally. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
And tonight, buildings across Canada have lowered their flags in honor of Brian Mulroney. And they will stay that way until sunset on the day of his state funeral. That is Global National for this Friday. Hope to see you back here again tomorrow. Have a great night.